The first letter I found was in a cardboard file box in my father's garage, 11 days after he died. I should back up. My father and I were not close. That sentence does a lot of heavy lifting, so let me put weight where it belongs. We were not estranged in any dramatic way. There was no single event, no argument I could point to and say, that's where it broke. What happened between us was quieter than that. He was a reserved man who lived alone in Dayton, Ohio, for the last 19 years of his life, and I was his only child. And I lived 4 hours east in a town outside of Altoona, Pennsylvania. And we spoke on the phone perhaps once every 5 or 6 weeks. And I visited perhaps once a year, usually around Christmas, but not always on Christmas itself. And the visits lasted 1 or 2 days and were cordial and hollow, and left both of us, I think, relieved when they ended. He died of a heart attack in his kitchen on a Tuesday in March. A neighbor found him Thursday. I drove out Saturday. I was his executor because there was no one else. His house was a small 3-bedroom ranch on a street of nearly identical houses, built in the late 60s, mature trees, quiet. The inside was clean in the way that old men who live alone keep things clean, minimal, functional, a little stale. He had a lazy boy and a television and a kitchen table where he clearly ate every meal alone, facing the window. There were no photographs of me anywhere in the common rooms. I noticed that immediately and told myself it didn't matter. The garage was where he kept his records. He was meticulous. Tax returns in sequence, medical records in their own box, insurance, the deed, car titles, all of it labeled in his blocky, left-slanting handwriting. I spent the better part of 2 days going through everything, sitting on a metal folding chair under the fluorescent shop light he'd installed in the ceiling. It was cold. March in Dayton is still winter. The file box was unlabeled. It was pushed behind a set of snow tires on the bottom shelf of a painted metal rack. I almost missed it entirely. I pulled it out because I was being thorough, because an executor is supposed to be thorough. And I opened it expecting receipts, or maybe old pay stubs. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some in envelopes, some loose, some folded into thirds. Most were on plain white paper, the kind you'd buy in a ream at an office supply store. A few were on lined notebook paper. They were in various states of handling, some crisp, some soft, from being read and refolded many times. They were all in my handwriting. I need to be clear about what I mean. I don't mean they were in handwriting that resembled mine. I don't mean they were close or similar or a good imitation. I mean they were in my handwriting the specific way I make a lowercase g with a tail that loops left instead of right. The way my capital T has a slight downward curve on the crossbar. The way I write the word because with the B and E, almost fused, a habit I've had since middle school. I sat in that cold garage and read the first letter, and my hands started shaking, not from fear, but from recognition. It was like hearing your own voice played back on a recording when you have no memory of speaking. The first letter was dated August 14th, 2019. It was addressed to someone named Gail Kohler. It read, "Dear Gail, I know we haven't met, but my father told me you were the one who brought food by when he had his surgery last spring. I wanted to thank you for that. He's not the kind of man who would tell you what it meant to him, so I'll say it. It meant he wasn't invisible for a few days. And for someone who has lived alone as long as he has, that matters more than I think either of us can measure. I'm sorry I wasn't there for it. I should have been. I'm working on being better about that. But I won't pretend I'm there yet. Thank you for being the person who showed up when I didn't. It was signed with my name, my full name, and below my name, my actual address in Altoona. I had not written that letter. I had never heard of Gail Kohler. I did not know my father had surgery in the spring of 2019. That last fact sat inside me like a stone. He had surgery, and he didn't tell me, or he told me and I don't remember, or I wasn't someone he thought to call. Any of those options was possible. All of them were terrible in different ways. I read another letter, dated November 2020, addressed to a man named Dennis Pauling. It was longer. In it, I, or whoever wrote as me, described a memory of watching my father repair a screen door when I was 8 or 9. The description was accurate. I did remember that. The letter connected that memory to something Dennis had apparently told my father about teaching his own grandson to use tools. And it reflected on how certain kinds of knowledge only pass through demonstration, never instruction, and how the men who carry that knowledge often don't know they're carrying anything at all because they experience it as just doing what needs to be done. It was thoughtful. It was precise. It was the kind of thing I might write if I sat down and really tried. But I hadn't written it. I read 6 more letters that night. Each one was addressed to a different person. Each one was dated. Each one was in my handwriting, my phrasing, my cadence. Each one referenced something specific about my father's life that I either didn't know or barely knew. And each one contained some emotional truth about me, about my distance from him, my guilt, my inability to close the gap that was so accurate it made my chest hurt. I drove back to Altoona the next day with a box in my trunk. I told myself I would deal with the house later. The letters were the problem. The letters were the thing that didn't make sense. At home, I spread them on my dining room table and sorted them by date. There were 43 letters total. The earliest was from June 2017. The most recent was from January of this year, roughly 2 months before my father died. They spanned almost 8 years. They were addressed to 19 different people. Some people received multiple letters. The frequency was irregular. Sometimes 3 letters in a month, sometimes a gap of 5 or 6 months. I recognized none of the names. Here is what I did next, and I want to describe it plainly because the sequence matters. I picked the most recent letter, the January one, and I looked up the recipient. Her name was Audrey Lentz. The letter to her was short. It said I'd been thinking about something she'd told my father about the difference between loneliness and solitude, and that I'd realized my father had been practicing solitude his entire life as a way of making loneliness into something dignified, and that I admired him for that, even though I also thought it was a way of refusing to need anyone, which is its own kind of sadness. It ended. I hope when you see him this week, you'll tell him something ordinary. He likes ordinary. It's spectacle that makes him retreat. I found an Audrey Lentz in Dayton through a basic online search. She was 71. She was listed as a member of the same church my father had attended sporadically, the one on Wilmington Avenue. I called her. She answered on the second ring. I told her my name. There was a pause, and then she said, Oh, honey, I was hoping you'd call. I'm so sorry about your dad. I asked her how she knew who I was. She said, well, we've been writing back and forth for a while now. I've got your letters right here. I kept all of them. I went quiet. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. She said, are you all right? I asked her what she meant by back and forth. She said she'd been writing to me too. She said my father had given her my address years ago and told her that I was shy about correspondence, but that I always appreciated hearing from people in his life. She said she'd written to me first, just a short note introducing herself, and that I'd written back within a week, and that we'd exchanged maybe a dozen letters over the past few years. She said I was a beautiful writer. She said the things I'd said about my father had helped her understand him better and had, in her words, given him a daughter in the room, even when you weren't in the room. I asked her to read me one of her letters to me. She did. It was a warm, plain letter about a church potluck and a funny thing my father had said about potato salad. It was addressed to me at my correct address in Altoona. I had never received it. Nothing from an Audrey Lentz had ever arrived in my mailbox. I was certain of this. I check my mail every day. I have for years. I thanked her and hung up. I sat at my dining room table for a very long time. Over the next several weeks, I contacted every person I could find from the letters. Not all at once. I spaced it out because each conversation cost me something, and I needed time to recover between them. I'll describe what I found in the order that I understood it, not the order I discovered it, because the order of discovery was chaotic, and the order of understanding is what matters. 19 people, all in or near Dayton, all connected to my father in some way, neighbors, church members, a woman from his hardware store, a former co-worker from the plant where he'd worked before retirement, a man who ran the diner where he ate breakfast on Saturdays. Every single one of them had received letters from me. Every single one of them believed they had a real, ongoing correspondence with me. Several of them had written back. Their return letters were addressed to me in Altoona. I never received any of them. And yet, my letters to them were real. They existed. Multiple people showed me their copies. The handwriting was mine. The paper was the same kind I keep in my home office. I checked the brand against a ream I had on my shelf, and it matched. The ink was consistent with the type of pen I use, a medium point black ballpoint, nothing special, the kind you buy in a 10-pack. I want to talk about what the letters said because this is where it becomes difficult in a way that isn't about impossibility. It's about precision. The letters knew me, not the way a forger knows a target's surface details, habits, biographical data. The letters knew the interior of me. They knew the specific texture of my guilt about my father. They knew the way I process emotional distance, not with anger or resentment, but with a kind of low-grade resignation that I've carried so long it feels like a personality trait rather than a wound. They knew that I admire practicality in other people because I associate it with a form of love that doesn't require performance. They knew that I find sincerity difficult not because I'm insincere, but because sincerity makes me feel exposed in a way that triggers a retreat I can't always control. They knew all of this, and they said it plainly in my voice to strangers who loved my father, in a way that made those strangers love me too. I hired a handwriting analyst, I want to describe this clearly because I anticipated skepticism from others and from myself. I took 5 of the letters from the box, and I provided 5 samples of my own confirmed handwriting. A journal entry, a birthday card I'd sent to a friend, which he returned to me at my request, a grocery list, a note I'd left for my landlord about a faucet repair, and a page of handwritten meeting notes from my job. I did not tell the analyst which documents were which. I paid for a full forensic comparison. The report came back in 10 days. All 10 documents were written by the same person, not similar, not consistent with. The same person. Identical letter formation, identical pressure patterns, identical baseline habits, identical micro-tremor signatures. The analyst noted in her summary that the consistency across the sample set was, in her words, unusually high even for confirmed single-author sets, meaning that my handwriting apparently varies less than most people's, which made the match even more definitive. I sat with that report for 3 days before I did anything else. Then I went back to Dayton. I visited Audrey Lentz in person. She lived in a small house with a lot of natural light and a cat named Herbert, who sat on the arm of her chair the entire time. She brought out every letter I'd supposedly written her, arranged in order by date. There were 11. She also brought out carbon copies, not photocopies, carbon copies, written on tissue-thin paper of every letter she'd written to me. She was that kind of person, organized, thoughtful, the type who keeps records because she believes correspondence matters. Her letters to me were wonderful. They were the kinds of letters a thoughtful older woman writes to the adult daughter of a friend. Gentle, newsy, occasionally wise, full of small observations about weather and meals, and the behavior of Herbert and the slow way the seasons change in that part of Ohio. She told me about my father in these letters. She told me things I didn't know. That he volunteered once a month at a food pantry run by the church. That he'd built a set of bookshelves for the church library with his own hands and refused to let anyone help. That he'd once driven 45 minutes in an ice storm to jumpstart the car of a woman named Phyllis Trent, who was 86, and that he'd stayed with Phyllis until her heat came back on, and then driven home without mentioning it to anyone. Audrey told me these things, and the letters I'd supposedly written back referenced them, responded to them, reflected on them, drew connections between these small acts of care and the man I remembered from childhood, the man who fixed the screen doors silently and never once said, "I love you," but who also never once failed to show up for anything structural, anything load-bearing, anything that kept the house standing. The letters were doing something I had never done. They were maintaining a relationship with my father's world. They were keeping a version of me present in Dayton, a version that was curious, engaged, grateful, specific. A version that asked follow-up questions. A version that remembered the names Audrey mentioned and asked about them in subsequent letters. A version that was, by any reasonable measure, a better daughter than I had been. That realization was the first thing that truly frightened me. I want to describe the fear accurately. It was not the fear of a haunting or a stalker or an intruder. It was the fear of looking at evidence of who you could have been and realizing the evidence is more real than anything you actually did. The letters were not aspirational. They were not the kind of thing you write in a journal about the person you wish you were. They were operational. They had been sent. They had been received. They had been answered. They had built something, a web of real human connection between me and 19 people I'd never met. And that web had existed for years, functioning perfectly, without my knowledge or participation. I was not the author of my own most meaningful relationships. I spoke to Dennis Pauling. He was a retired millwright, 80 years old, hands like geography. He'd been my father's closest friend for the last decade of his father's life. He showed me 7 letters from me. In them, I'd asked him detailed questions about machining, about tolerances, about the difference between precision and accuracy. I don't know anything about machining. But the questions were good. They were the kind of questions a thoughtful person asks when they're genuinely trying to understand someone else's expertise, not performing interest, but actually pursuing it. Dennis told me that answering my letters had been one of the most satisfying things he'd done since retirement. He said most people don't ask the right questions. He said I did. I spoke to a woman named Karen Oleski, who ran the diner on Brant Street. She'd received 4 letters from me, all of them thanking her for things she'd done for my father, remembering his coffee order when he'd been coming in less frequently, saving him the booth by the window, noticing when he seemed low and making small talk, even when he didn't reciprocate. My letters to Karen were shorter than the others, more practical, but they contained one line that I keep returning to. In the 3rd letter, dated April 2021, I'd written, "You're part of the architecture of his days, and I want you to know that someone notices the walls even when the person living inside them doesn't." That sentence is mine. I don't mean I wrote it. I mean it sounds like something I would write. The metaphor is mine. The way it turns a compliment into a structural observation is mine. The slight emotional distance, even in the act of expressing gratitude, that's mine too. Whoever or whatever wrote these letters didn't just replicate my handwriting. It replicated my mind. I kept visiting. I drove to Dayton 4 times in 6 weeks. Each person I met treated me with warmth that I hadn't earned, but that felt, despite everything, genuine. They knew things about me, things the letters had told them that were true. My job, the town I lived in, my preference for black coffee, my habit of reading before bed, the way I organize my bookshelves by subject rather than author. Small, correct details woven into correspondence that I had never conducted. And each of them, when I sat with them in their homes, told me things about my father that I should have known, that he talked about me often, that he kept a photograph of me, the one from my college graduation, in his wallet, that he told Dennis Pauling once that the hardest thing he'd ever done was learn to stop calling me, because he'd realized his calls made me tense, and he'd rather have me comfortable and distant than anxious and in contact. That he made that decision deliberately, as an act of love, and that it had cost him something every single day. I did not know any of this. He never told me. I never asked. The letters, apparently, had been asking on my behalf for years. I need to describe the next part carefully, because it's the part I understand least. I went back to my father's house and searched more thoroughly. In his bedroom closet, on the top shelf, behind a stack of folded blankets, I found a second box. This one was smaller. Inside were letters addressed to me from the 19 people that had been opened, read, and stored. These were the letters that should have come to me in Altoona, but never did. They had been mailed, Each envelope had a postmark. Each was addressed to me at my correct address, with correct postage. But they were here, in my father's closet, opened. I stared at them for a long time, trying to construct a theory. My father intercepted the return mail. That would mean he was involved. He wrote the letters himself in a perfect imitation of my handwriting, and then intercepted the responses so I'd never know. It was the only rational explanation, but it didn't hold. It didn't hold because of the handwriting analysis. My father's handwriting was nothing like mine. He wrote in blocky capitals, left slanting with a heavy hand. The analyst had confirmed all the documents were written by a single author, and that author was me. And it didn't hold because of the content. My father could not have written those letters. He didn't have access to my internal life with that level of precision. He didn't know about my bookshelves. He didn't know about my coffee. He hadn't been inside my house in over a decade. And the emotional register, the specific way the letters processed guilt and distance and admiration and resentment, was not his. His emotional register was sparse, pragmatic, compressed. Mine is recursive and metaphorical. Even when I'm trying to be plain, the letters were recursive and metaphorical, even when they were trying to be plain. There was also the matter of the return letters. If my father had orchestrated this, he would have needed to intercept mail from my mailbox in Altoona, 4 hours away, repeatedly, over 8 years, without my knowledge. And the envelopes in his closet showed no sign of forwarding. They were addressed to me, postmarked from Dayton, and they were here, as if they had been mailed but had arrived at his house instead of mine, as if the correspondence had a geography of its own, and that geography routed everything back through him. I spoke to my father's mail carrier. His name was Rich, and he'd had the route for 12 years. I asked him if my father ever received unusual amounts of mail. Rich said no, the usual. Bills, flyers, the occasional personal letter. He said my father was a quiet guy who always had the mailbox flag up on Tuesdays, which is when he'd send things out. I asked if he ever saw letters addressed to someone other than my father arriving at that address. Rich said no, not that he recalled. So the return letters weren't being misdelivered to my father's house through the postal system. They were just there. I sat with Dennis Pauling one more time on what I think was my 4th visit. We were in his garage, which was a workshop. He was showing me a set of calipers he'd had for 40 years. I asked him something I hadn't been able to ask anyone else yet. Did my father ever mention the letters? Dennis looked at me carefully. He said, "He's the one who told me you'd be writing." I asked what he meant. He said that in the summer of 2017, my father had come to him and said that I wanted to start reaching out to the people in his life, but that I was shy and would probably never do it face to face, so I'd be writing instead. He said my father seemed happy about it, relieved even. He said it was the most animated he'd seen my father in years. I asked Dennis if my father ever said anything else about the letters, anything about how they started, or why. Dennis said no. He said my father treated it as the most natural thing in the world. His daughter was writing. That was enough for him. I drove home that night through 4 hours of dark highway. And I want to describe what I was feeling because it's important and it's not what you might expect. I was not terrified. I was not panicked. I was grieving. I was grieving in a way I hadn't been able to when he actually died. Because when he died, I grieved the way you grieve a formality with appropriate sadness and a quick return to normal. But now I was grieving the relationship I'd never had with him, which had somehow existed anyway, maintained by letters I didn't write, built on truths I didn't share, sustaining connections I didn't make. A better version of my relationship with my father had been running parallel to the empty one I'd actually lived. And I'd had no idea. And now he was gone. And the only evidence it existed was a box of letters and 19 people who loved a version of me I'd never been. When I got home, I checked my mailbox. There was a letter inside, handwritten, addressed to me, from Audrey Lentz. It was a condolence letter. She said she missed my father terribly, and she knew I did too. She said she hoped I'd keep writing. She said Herbert was doing well and had started sleeping on the radiator now that the weather was warming up. She said she'd made my father's favorite, a lemon pound cake, and brought it to the church reception after the memorial service I hadn't attended because I didn't know there was one. The letter was postmarked 5 days ago from Dayton. It was addressed to me in Altoona, and it had arrived in my mailbox. This was the first piece of return correspondence that had ever reached me. I held it in my kitchen for a long time. Then I sat down and read it again. Then I read it a third time. Audrey's handwriting was thin and careful, slightly shaky in the way that very neat elderly handwriting becomes when the hand tires. She closed the letter. "Write when you can. No rush. I'll be here." I put the letter on my dining room table next to the box of letters I'd brought from my father's garage. I went to bed. I did not sleep well. Over the next week, 3 more letters arrived. One from Dennis, one from Karen Oleski, one from a man named Bill Atchison, who'd been in my father's woodworking group at the community center. All of them were addressed to me, postmarked from Dayton, delivered to my actual mailbox in Altoona. All of them were warm, familiar, and written to someone they clearly considered a real and valued correspondent. The return letters were reaching me now. Whatever had been routing them to my father's house had stopped when he died. The circuit had changed, and I understood, not intellectually but physically, in the way your body understands a change in altitude, that the correspondence was waiting for me to continue it. I did something then that I need to describe, honestly. I sat down at my desk with a sheet of plain white paper and a black ballpoint pen, and I wrote a letter to Audrey Lentz. I wrote it myself, deliberately, consciously, in my own hand. I thanked her for the condolence letter. I told her I was sorry I missed the memorial. I told her I was still sorting through my father's things and finding pieces of him I didn't know were there. I told her about the bookshelves he'd built for the church, which I only knew about because of the earlier letters, and how I wished I'd seen them. I asked about Herbert. I asked about the lemon pound cake recipe. It was a simple letter. It took me 40 minutes to write because I kept stopping. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what to say. And the ease of it disturbed me. The words came naturally. The rhythm was right. The emotional register warm but slightly held back. Interested but not effusive. Personal but not confessional was exactly the register of the letters in the box. I was writing the way the letters wrote. I mailed it the next morning. Then I wrote to Dennis. Then to Karen. Then to Bill Atchison. Over the course of 2 weeks, I wrote to all 19 people. Each letter felt natural. Each one came easily. Each one was, I believe, genuine, drawn from things I'd learned during my visits, responsive to things they'd told me, honest about my feelings, careful with theirs, but the naturalness was what unnerved me. I had never been a letter writer. I had never been someone who maintained correspondence. I had never been someone who reached out. The gap between my father and me existed precisely because I'm not that kind of person, or I believed I wasn't. And now I was writing letter after letter with a fluency that felt less like a new skill and more like a remembered one, as if I were resuming something I'd been doing all along. 3 weeks after I mailed the first batch, the responses started coming. Audrey wrote back with the pound cake recipe and a story about my father accidentally locking himself out of his car in the church parking lot and standing in the rain for 20 minutes before admitting he needed help. Dennis wrote back with a photograph of a birdhouse my father had made for him. Dovetail joints, no nails, and a note that said, "Your dad would have liked knowing you're still in touch. He worried about you being alone." Karen wrote a postcard. "The booth's still here if you ever come through." Each letter that arrived made me feel something I can only describe as structurally unfamiliar. Not happiness exactly. Something closer to the feeling of load-bearing walls shifting, the house still standing, but the weight distributed differently. I was being integrated into a community I hadn't built, through a correspondence I hadn't started, and the integration felt correct. This is where I need to be most precise. I began to wonder whether the original letters, the ones in the box, the ones I didn't write, had been wrong. I'd been treating them as an anomaly, a violation, an impossible thing. But the more I wrote, and the more responses I received, and the more I learned about my father through the people who'd known him best, the more the letters began to seem like something else. Not a forgery, not a haunting, not a trick. Something more like a draft, a version of events that should have happened, put down on paper and mailed into the world as if doing so could make it true. And it had made it true. The relationships existed. The warmth was real. The knowledge was accurate. 19 people had known me for years. And when I finally showed up in person, I was exactly who the letters said I was. Not because I was performing, because the letters had been right about me. They had described the person I would have been if I'd tried. And when I finally tried, that person was already there. I don't know how to explain that. I don't know if it's comforting or terrifying. I think it might be both, and I think the inability to separate those two things is the permanent condition the letters left me in. I want to tell you about one more thing. It's the thing I haven't told anyone. And it's the reason I'm telling this story at all. 6 weeks after I started writing my own letters, the real ones, the ones I was consciously choosing to send, I was at my desk late at night, writing to a woman named Phyllis Trent. The same Phyllis Trent my father had driven through an ice storm to help. She was 88 now, mostly housebound, and her letters to me were brief but surprisingly funny. I was writing to her about a bird I'd seen from my kitchen window, a cedar waxwing, which I'd had to look up, and I stopped mid-sentence because my hand was moving ahead of my thought. I don't mean I was writing fast. I mean the sentence was completing itself before I decided what to say. The pen was forming words at the same pace as always, in my handwriting, in my rhythm. But the content was arriving from somewhere, slightly ahead of my conscious intention. I was watching my hand write a sentence about how cedar waxwings eat fermented berries and sometimes fly erratically afterward, and how Phyllis would probably appreciate the image of a drunk bird in a crabapple tree, and I had not decided to write that sentence. I hadn't looked up whether cedar waxwings eat fermented berries. I didn't know if Phyllis had a crabapple tree, but the sentence was right. I checked later, and it was right on both counts. I put the pen down. I sat very still. My hand felt normal. My mind felt normal. But for the length of that sentence, maybe 10 seconds, I had not been the one composing. It happened again 2 days later, and again the following week. Always late at night, always while writing to one of the 19. Always just a sentence or two, never a full letter, never a paragraph. A line that was smarter than I intended, or more specific than I knew how to be, or more emotionally direct than I would have chosen. Each time, the sentence was accurate. Each time, it sounded like me. Each time, I had the brief, vertiginous sensation of my own hand being fluent in a language I almost spoke. I don't know what's writing through me. I don't know if that's the right way to phrase it. Maybe nothing is writing through me. Maybe this is what it feels like to become the person the letters described, to grow into a version of yourself that was always possible but never activated. And to feel the remaining distance between who you were and who you're becoming as a small, intermittent gap where something else fills in the margin. Maybe the letters were a scaffold, and I'm building the thing they held space for. And sometimes the scaffold is still doing a little of the work. Or maybe my father found a way to make me right. Maybe whatever he did, whatever impossible thing generated those letters, is still running. And my decision to continue the correspondence didn't replace the mechanism, but merge with it. And now I can't tell where my own volition ends and the older process begins. I think about his decision to stop calling me, the deliberate withdrawal, the years of silence that I experienced as indifference, but that Dennis Pauling described as the hardest thing my father ever did. I think about how a man who chose not to call might also choose to write, or to make writing happen through some channel I can't identify, in a hand he couldn't replicate, saying things he couldn't say, building the relationship he wanted by proxy, letter by letter, year by year, until the proxy became the thing itself. I think about the photograph in his wallet, the one from my graduation. I found it when I was sorting his personal effects. It was worn soft. The edges were rounded from being handled. He'd looked at it often. On the back, in his handwriting, his real handwriting, the blocky capitals, he'd written a single line. She would if she could. I have read that line more times than I can count. I don't know if it's a statement of faith or a diagnosis. I don't know if it means he believed I wanted to be closer but couldn't, or if it means he decided I would have been closer if something in me had been different. And so he made that something different on paper, by hand, and mailed it into the world 43 times. I'm still writing to all 19 of them. Audrey and I speak on the phone now, every Sunday. Dennis sent me one of my father's hand planes, a number 4 Stanley, worn smooth on the sole, and I keep it on my bookshelf. Karen saved the booth for me when I drove through Dayton last month. And I sat in it and ate a grilled cheese and drank black coffee and cried in a way I hadn't cried in years. Not from sadness, but from something else. something I still don't have a word for. The sentences still come, the ones that arrive before I think them. Not often. Maybe once every few letters. Always small, always right. Always in my voice, or in a voice so close to mine that the difference is undetectable, even to me. I let them come. I don't fight them. I don't stop writing when I feel the slight shift in authorship. I finish the sentence and move on to the next one, which is always mine, fully mine. And the letter goes out in the morning mail and arrives in Dayton or wherever it's going, and is read by someone who has known me for years and who writes back with warmth I did not earn, but am learning, slowly, to accept. And sometimes, late at night, after I've sealed the envelope and set it by the door, I sit at my desk and look at my hand, at the pen still warm between my fingers, and I feel the faintest residual motion, a kind of readiness in the tendons, as if the hand wants to keep going, as if there are more letters to write, to people I haven't found yet, in places I haven't looked. I don't know whose readiness that is. I pick up the pen sometimes, just to see. I hold it over a blank page, and I wait, and my hand is still, and the page stays white, and I feel I want to be precise. I feel relieved and disappointed in exactly equal measure. And then I put the pen down, and I go to bed, and in the morning there is nothing on the page. But I check. Every morning, I check, because the first 43 times I didn't know I was writing either.